Okay, so we're welcoming Dr. Dave Keatley today. He's going to talk to us about sequence analysis. Welcome. Thank you for speaking to me, Dr. Keatley.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming to see me.
So tell me, what is sequence analysis?
It's just a way of analysing, I guess, the chain of behaviours over time. So everything you do happens in an episode over time. So today you did various things, went for a walk around the city, came to meet me, and there's a sequence that occurs in. So what we do when I do the analysis in relation to crime and serial killers or cold cases is look for those patterns that emerge in people's lives. So what's the typical pattern of offences for homicide cases where someone's broken into a house? And then we look for those patterns, those similarities, to see whether cases we're investigating follow a particular pattern and what that can tell us about how typical or atypical they are.
But isn't each behaviour, each crime scene different? How do you pick out which behaviours you're going to examine?
Yeah, that's true. So the first thing we do is we have to code them or categorise them. And part of that is figuring out, are we looking at the same behaviour or different? So at a very discrete level, you could say that breaking in through the front window or the back window of a house are different behaviours. And that'd be entirely true. Or you could suggest that breaking and entering is a method of gaining access. So how you split them up plays a large important role in how you then can compare across cases. But that categorisation stage I usually do with the police officers I'm working with, so they know exactly the categorisation scheme I'm using. But yeah, the big issue is, are we looking at the same or similar? For instance,
so if you coded one variable as breaking and entering, whether it was through the front or the back, would you then go back once you've got to a later stage and then change that?
Yeah, so normally when I start these, I start at the most descriptive, detailed level possible. So it would be right down to which window and which part of the house. The reason for that being is once you've got this highly detailed map of behaviours, you can generalise up very quickly. You can't go the other direction. So if we just said breaking and entering, and then prosecution, defence or investigators came to us and said, well, did they break the door down or did they come through a window or was there some other method? We wouldn't have that in our data if we just started at that higher order category. So we start with a very detailed one, usually far too over detailed, and it splits the cases apart much too much. So then we have to look for the more behavioural trends, like whether they're breaking through the door or the window is still a B&E.
And so how do you determine whether or not these behaviours are linked in the sequence that they are?
In terms of transitions, so that's where the stats analysis comes in. So the way we do that is we take behavioural pairs, so A to B and B to C. So let's say they break in through the window, in a very broad list. A is they break in to the house. B is they begin ransacking or they begin destroying property. So you've got A and B. Then we look for a number of crimes and see how many times we see breaking and entering immediately followed by destruction of property, compared to breaking and entering versus then scouting the premises. Perhaps they begin searching for expensive goods, which would be C. And essentially we count up how many times we see A and B, how many times people break in and just ransack compared to break in and begin scouting for expensive goods.
And what sort of size databases would you be working with on that?
For high volume crimes like B&Es, we can go up to hundreds or thousands of cases. For homicide cases, usually much, much smaller, which means our ability to conclude or draw out generalizations is greatly diminished. Because if we're only dealing with a very small database, only a few cases where we've seen something similar. In the statistical sense, it's significant, but in an applied sense, it's much more contentious to draw a strong conclusion. Because you might have seen, 10 or 20 cases where this occurs, but that's not a huge sample to be able to infer.
So what's the ultimate aim of sequence analysis? What does it aim to do?
One of the biggest aim is to be able to start mapping and predicting behaviours in terms of what we're likely to see, what we would expect to see. And one of the reasons for that is, in a way, being able to go backwards to do the data set. So one use of that is if we know what the typical B&E and homicide sequences are, then when we come to a homicide case, we know what behaviours to look for, or what we would expect to see in this type of case, which can guide either forensically or investigators. Did we see that? Was that missed? Or is it simply missing from the actual case itself? And that can lead to investigations of why were they interrupted, was there another motive, have they developed or have they changed their style or signature? I guess the other thing it does, and when I do this in terms of my cold case work, is sequence analysis becomes very useful for understanding the pattern of behaviours that likely occurred in the crime scene and then comparing that to witness statements or suspect statements.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know that in most cases where this type of offence has occurred, we would see this progression of behaviours, would we see that, or is that reflected by the statements made?
And what sort of percentage of cases would you be able to reliably say this happens in most cases? What would that sort of percentage be?
We've not really done the percentages, almost a case by case, depending on what it is. So we ran a similar analysis for plane bombings, but again, we were looking at only about 10 or 20 cases. So it's a really small subset. So in terms of reliability and percentages, the data's not there yet, which again weakens our ability to say this definitely occurs and shy away from that. But in terms of as an investigative tool or something that would be used in an investigation to perhaps facilitate more questioning, or if someone's saying something we know is atypical of these cases, however small, again, it's usually just a case of encouraging investigators to then focus in on that part of the behavioural sequence or that part of the chain, because the statements we're being given aren't reflecting the norms. So
would it be right in thinking that in this sequence of behaviours you would be able to relate that to different cases and say the same individual is likely to have committed these same cases?
Yeah, so the other uses of sequence analysis is crime linkage. So my associate Professor Clark and I developed behavioural fingerprinting, which is when you see a sequence of behaviours at a crime scene and a sequence in another crime scene, can we infer whether it's the same criminal that's a culprit for these? And there's various linkage methods in criminology for that. Most of them, well, a lot of them are based on the idea of how many behaviours do we see in crime A, how many in crime B, and what's the overlap. The idea that Clark and I had was what's the sequence of those behaviours, because that's in many ways more important. It's what order they're performing these behaviours in. Tells you a lot more than just the type of behaviours there are. And then the other use we use this for is in life history sequencing. So if we zoom out and look at someone's entire life, we did this with serial killers in a couple of papers now. So study a large database of serial killers from birth right the way through to their multiple crimes and see what their general progression is from childhood abuse through to early adolescence, schooling, whether they've been in the army or not, their job history, prior crimes, breaking and entering through to sexual assault, so on and so forth. And then the idea for that was when we come to a crime scene, we see a particular pattern of behaviours, or if we're looking at linked cases and we see this pattern, can we then start to build up some kind of profile of the type of individual likely to commit these? What kind of things in their history do we typically see in cases if we see things like overkill, multiple stab wounds, and some form of staging or posing? That's a quite specific type of criminal. So we go back to the data and say, when we see these things, what's the likely life history of these individuals? And then we can go to a suspect list and say, do any of these have some of those in their history? In which case,
so in that sense, have you examined the progression? Because with serial killers and violent serial offenders, there's always a progression in the level of violence used.
That's exactly what we're working on now. So the first papers, we're just looking at serial killers and their life history. What I'm much more interested in now is looking at the individual kills of serial killers and how they change and how they evolve and in what place. For a couple of reasons. One, to understand that better and why they evolve or what parts evolve. And two, because in several cases I'm working on, we have convicted serial killers. We know they've committed these crimes, they've admitted them, or forensics have proven it. But then a lot of police want to suggest that they're also responsible for other murders. And if we can begin to map the progression of serial killers, what behaviours remain stable, which ones change, we can kind of then try and match it and see if it slots into that progression or not. So if this serial killer is arrested for murders in 2000, 2005, 2009, and there's an unsolved 2008, we want to build a metric that says, yep, that fits the pattern they were at that time, which isn't so well done yet in the literature. And we're working on it. Come back in a year.
Okay. So you'd said that you looked at their life history, the course of the life history of known serial killers and known violent serial offenders, and then related that to their progression in violence after that. So are you able to reliably map the stages at which each level of violence or their level of behaviour or their level of treatment escalated and changed?
Yep, we've just started looking into that. The issue with it, I guess, is that it's not clear cut, and this was something we should have expected before we started. So again, we just took a number of serial killers and looked at their life histories. But of course, serial killers is a broad term in terms of the different typologies of serial killer, and that's something we hadn't broken down for. So in terms of their escalation patterns, hugely different, and we're still working our way through that because the database is huge and wasn't set up for that purpose. So the first thing we have to do is recalibrate, rewrite the data set in sequential terms to then analyze it. So we are working on that too, or my team are working on that in terms of their escalation patterns. The other way we're doing that is by looking at risk factors for when the time between attacks, because again, that varies and being able to predict for various reasons. One, if it's an ongoing case, we want to be able to say how great a risk they are in the near future. Also, in terms of linking other cases to known serial killers, we want to be able to say, again, that 2000, 2005, 2009, if their pattern is to wait 4 to 5 years between each of the kills, and if that's the normal pattern, then we know the 2008 is unlikely to be them unless something changes. So we're trying to figure out not only the sequence of behaviours, but the time between behaviours too, and repeated offences.
So how do you determine, is it simply with the numbers that occur at each crime scene that you determine which specific behaviours you're going to pick up and analyse and assess?
No, we use every behaviour there that we can find, which is a limitation because it means that several crimes we don't have the full knowledge of every behaviour. Either police are withholding that information or it just was never collected. So it is an imperfect system in that sense. We don't dismiss any of the behaviours because it would be wrong to do so. We've got no reason to do so. But we know full well that we could be missing data in that list, which is why we often, when we do the actual formal analysis, we take the cases with the most amount of information available, where we either have access to the full case files or the case files being made publicly available, so there's no missing information. But that's a much smaller subset of the overall data set that we have, which again has huge limitations for generalisability.
That's understandable because in some of the cases I've worked on, only partial information has been available, and it's what information the police have been willing to release or the media has reported on.
Yeah.
And it's not always what has actually happened.
No, and through the police aren't always aware of the behaviours, so things like staging of a crime scene aren't always picked up on. So even though we don't see staging of a crime scene reported, doesn't mean it didn't occur. It just might mean the police weren't looking for it at the time or didn't pick up on all of that information. So one of the difficulties I have is wearing two hats, one as an academic and one as a consultant, in that when I'm working as a consultant, I have access to all of the information. I can run the analysis in much more detail. When I'm then trying to publish work on the area, I don't have the ability to publish that information. So that's a detriment because the publications end up being a stage removed using imperfect data sets. And that's just an issue of, I guess, the difference between applied and academic work. And usually just means I publish the method rather than the data itself. So a couple of my recent publications have used dummy data sets. And the idea is, here's the method and when people work on cases, you can use that analysis. But the actual data set for those papers isn't as good because I can't use case files.
Oh, that's frustrating.
It is, yeah, understandable, but frustrating. And then you get reviewers telling you, well, just tell us what cases you're working on, or anonymise or use a different name. But when you're dealing with sequences of behaviour, detailing the exact crime scene, and there's various reasons why that's a terrible idea to be publishing. So, yeah, it makes publishing, it's harder in some journals. Some of the journals that publishing are really keen for that, and they're usually ones with applied practitioners as readership or editors or reviewers, and they can understand full well why they're getting a dummy data set or a kind of improvised data set for publication reasons. But yeah, it's just a frustration. Okay.
So tell me about the relationship between academics and practitioners then.
It's getting better. So I work a lot with detectives and groups in America at the moment, which is great. Generally, it's still a very strained relationship. I think it's a worldwide enterprise between academics and police for various historical reasons. But yeah, I do a lot of work in America, every time I go there, I get more cases thrown at me, which is great, and it's working out well. But it's still an extremely difficult thing to get into, and I have a lot of students wanting to do the same. It just isn't the norm. And I think a large part of that is still because a lot of academic work isn't useful in an applied sense.
Well, talking about being useful in an applied sense, from what you said, I can definitely see the value with cold cases. However, what about when there's an active case and police are looking for suspects? Would sequence analysis be of use to that investigation?
Yeah, so I'm working on a case at the moment, a current case, involving a young child going missing. And a couple of things I'm working for in that. One is looking at statements that are being made by witnesses and suspects. And one of the things for that is that we do the same kind of sequence analysis, but this time with statements that they're making. And we see how the internal validity of a statement changes across one interrogation compared to the next, which is useful. And it's a very neat way of showing differences and changes over time, which again, police are aware of that and know how to do that, but being able to show them some more statistical analysis of when it's changing and what's changing helps. And then the flip side of that, again, is it can work in real time in terms of we look for other similar cases of young children that have gone missing. We look for, in those cases, what occurred, when did it occur, why did it occur? And then again, we can use that as our kind of test sample or our database to apply it to the current case. Which one of those most closely match or align, for what reasons, and what can that tell us about suspects in this case, or the likely sequence of events? And again, all of that and everything I do doesn't solve crimes. The idea is not to solve a crime. It's certainly not at that stage, if it ever is at that stage. The idea is I can go back to investigators and say, look, in cases similar to this, where it's similar in these terms and these sequences and these chains of behaviours, this is how they investigated it, or this was their main suspect. So in terms of your case, it might be worth asking these questions to this person, finding out what their statement is. Or here's sequences of events for similar cases. I've looked through the statements made by your suspects, and this suspect's statement doesn't match what we would expect and doesn't match what's occurred in this case. So it's worth going back and just asking them to clarify this, or just picking up on what they meant by that statement, or why didn't they answer this.
Okay.
So it can work in real time. I'm happy to do those. I'm not as big a fan of doing real-time cases because the stress is a lot more. And the pressures, which are understandable, but it takes a long time to do this kind of analysis. It's not the type of profile work like on TV where you walk in and say, that's the guy getting.
Do you mean you can't do it like Cracker?
Yeah, I'll never be cracking. Which is a shame. I enjoy those TV shows as much as the next person, but they give a very false sense of reality. And I think some detectives still believe that's what a profiler should do, walk in and say, there's your guy, arrest him now, and then build a profile about their personality. The difficulty is when I walk in saying, well, I need to take some time to consider all of these things. I need to look at the forensic records or the autopsies or the interrogations. It doesn't sound as glamorous. So I think that's another strain that a lot of police have one of two views of academics, either we're boring people who just want to do a lot of analysis and get nowhere fast, or we're not to be trusted and they don't do anything useful. But it's slowly changing, and the groups I work with in America are really good proponents of using academics, which is good. So, yeah.
And so where would you hope sequence analysis would be able to grow, in what area, or how would you expect the subject to expand?
I mean, at the moment it's expanding more rapidly than I can keep up with, which is great. So everything, I think there's not many areas of criminology left that sequences aren't being applied to, which is great. I'm very happy for that to continue. In my own personal interest, it's all about cold cases. And I think trying to form the links between sequencing statement analysis and interrogations and sequencing behaviours is something I'm interested in, because for cold cases, that's mostly all we have left. We either don't have the evidence anymore or don't have access to it. That said, it's been used everywhere. Future crime is the next big one, looking at especially Internet of Things and how people are using Internet and various dark web resources. Scares me, but I think it's a good use for it. So, yeah, but that's all of the rest of REBSA that are working on that.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking with me.
No
today.
worries,
We'll
thank
finish
you.
up about sequence analysis.